And our brother, we are ready for your time. Thank you.
Well, thanks. Boy, you guys turned into quite a crowd. That was beautiful. Thank you so much. I hope you had a good break, and we're ready to jump right back into probably some of the most exciting angel passages, and maybe the ones you think of first oftentimes. Let's see if we can share here. Okay, there we go. That seems right. Some of the most exciting passages as we look at angels. We want to note here, and this is an important point, is that we're in a different genre. Today we're going to look, or at this point, we're going to look at the prophets actually for this and the next section, what we call the prophets, what we might think of as the writing prophets, right? So those are, of course, divided into what we call the major and the minor prophets. There is no distinction in them insofar as their import or their theological value. The distinction is primarily in terms of size, and really minor prophets is probably not a great moniker for them. The Jewish people call it the scroll of the 12, because they tend to be shorter books. Hosea and Zechariah are actually quite long, but they tend to be shorter books. They all fit on one big scroll, and so that was the scroll of the 12, and that's how we kind of came to regard them as a separate category. But there's no distinction between them other than, primarily the size, the amount. And when we look at what we call the major prophets, the Isaiahs and the Jeremiahs and Ezekiels, we want to recognize that these books are not single book, single line books. If we look at, say, Luke, the very clear impression is that Luke sat down over a course of maybe days, weeks, months, whatever it was, and wrote down a story or the accounts as he had them and organized them as he wanted. However, with these prophets, we see that they are, generally speaking, sort of montages of their entire prophetic career. So we notice that they do change in tone and style as they go forward. They move in and out between very hard-hitting kind of direct revelation to more the sort of revelation that it comes from the Holy Spirit inspiring them to speak the truth in their context. And we also want to recognize that the idea of prophets as one who foretell the future is only part of the prophetic ministry. In fact, most of what the prophets writing and speaking prophets being like Elijah and Elisha and Micaiah, like we saw in the other study, these people, their primary purpose was to call Israel back to God, to call Israel to, or the kings of Israel, or sometimes the common people, right, back to that relationship with the Lord. So we can never let that escape from our viewpoint. And the other thing we want to note is that we want to avoid making strange presuppositions or jumps, again, as we've said many times in this, that this is a new style, certainly a new genre that's being presented, this prophetic genre. But we would also want to note that they're the same angels, right? We have the same words being used. We've been exposed to these things, these ideas before. Again, there's some new, certainly there's new revelation about it, but we have to remember that complements what's been given. We don't want to assume that just because we see something that is unique or different, that somehow means that this is a total redraw, or again, something else. So the descriptions of angels in the Old Testament prophets are striking, and one would expect. Many secular scholars suggest that the writing of the prophets was heavily influenced by the angelology of the other ancient Near Eastern cultures around them, most of all by that of Babylon and Persia. Yet the biblical text shows the exact opposite of this to be the case. The prophets add very little to the concept, nature, and duty of angels. The things that they reveal are important, to be sure. There is not, however, any new kind of celestial being really being introduced here, in my opinion. Occasionally, the clarity surrounding these beings is increased, but by and large, they differ very little from the angelic appearances that have appeared hitherto in the Holy Scripture, as the following analyses, I believe, our study today will show. So we get to start off with a really exciting, fun passage on Isaiah 6, 1 through 7. And that reads, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on the throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With two he covered his face, with two he covered his feet, and with two he flew. And one cried to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the posts of the door were shaken by the voice of him who cried out, and the house was filled with smoke. So I said, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a live coal, which he had taken with tongs from the altar, and he touched my mouth with it and said, Behold, Behold, this has touched your lips, your iniquity is taken away, and your sin is purged. Okay, so we're looking at this great passage, this wonderful passage, this beautiful picture, and I'd like us to just take a moment and really appreciate what this was like, how absolutely overwhelming this was for Isaiah to see and behold this this majesty and grandeur. We're going to see the same kind of reaction or experience in John when he has also witnesses the heavenly throne room. But take a moment and appreciate in your imagination all that you can see, and then recognize that as much as you can imagine about this, it would undoubtedly fall short of the goal. So in this passage, as readers, we encounter this newly titled celestial being. A new creature called a seraph is in the singular, or seraphim in the plural. We talked about this word, but now this is where we get to encounter it. This title is peculiar to the writing of Isaiah. We don't see it again. These creatures are remarkable flying creatures described by Isaiah as having 6 wings that are used to fly, as well as covering feet and face. These creatures are constantly repeating this refrain about the holiness of the Lord. A seraph is also the one to provide Isaiah with a living coal for its purification. So let's look at some of the thinking on what these seraphs are about. So here's Erdman's dictionary, what it has to say in its entry. Heavenly beings seen by Isaiah in his inaugural vision, probably so called because they shone brightly like fire. Seraphim have 6 wings, 2 for covering their faces, lest they look directly at God, 2 for covering their feet, a euphemism for the genitals, which speaks of modesty and warns against the Canaanite fertility cults, 2 for flying. When Isaiah complains of his unclean lips, the seraphs purify him with a coal taken from their altar. The seraphim were most likely serpentine in shape and as suggested by the fiery or poisonous serpents sent to bite the Israelites when they complained in the wilderness, Numbers 21:6 and Deuteronomy 8:15. Here, the name may refer to their shiny skins, to the burning pain associated with their bites. Moses is instructed to fashion a bronze serpent and mount it on a pole. It was still in the temple at the time of Isaiah's call. Isaiah twice refers to the flying fiery seraphs or serpents, mythological creatures rather than heavenly seraphim. Excavations have unearthed a number of scarab seals with winged serpents, some of them approximate time of Isaiah. In addition, winged serpents surround the throne of Pharaoh in Egyptian art, vision of the heavenly kingdom. So I'd like to point out that here we're noticing that there is not express evidence for these to be serpentine or serpent-like in appearance. In fact, all the new information we're getting is that they're fiery. So we have to make some big jumps and, again, be heavily influenced by the belief, the firmly held belief that somehow these secular or these other cultures are affecting the world in order to come to this sort of conclusion of these serpentine creatures rather. But what we see is they don't seem serpentine at all. I mean, as we look at them, as we see hands, feet, genital, all these other business that's about. So moving on, Easton's Bible Dictionary has to say, is mentioned in Isaiah 6:2, 3, 6, and 7. This word means fiery ones. An allusion is supposed to their burning love. They are represented as standing above the king as he sat upon his throne, ready at once to minister to him. Their form appears to have been human with the addition of wings. This word in the original panel is used elsewhere only of fiery serpents sent by God as his instrument to inflict on the people the righteous penalty of sin. So I think Easton's has a better take in my viewpoint. Easton's has a more reverent take in terms of not saying, well, because this, adjective is used, therefore, and it's used of a snake, and it's also used of these creatures, these must be snake-like. That doesn't follow. In fact, quite to the contrary, the reason why the snake is talked about in that way is the same reason these are, this idea of this burning love, this burning kind of holiness of God. And they seem to be, again, representing the same thing, the same function or office as the cherub, those who are called cherubs, and also the four living creatures. That is to say that they are worshiping God, and they seem to be protecting the throne room of God, and more to the point. So we'll look at that in a moment. But just to make sure we get a fully rounded viewpoint on this, Ezekiel's cherubim are clearly, the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, William Carver, I believe, wrote this entry, says, or edited it rather. Ezekiel's cherubim are clearly related to the seraphim in Isaiah's inaugural vision. Like the cherubim, the seraphim are the attendants on God, and he's seated upon the throne, high and exalted. They're also winged creatures. With twain they cover their face, with twain they cover their feet, with twain they fly. Like the Levites in the sanctuary below, they sing a hymn of adoration. Holy, holy, holy is Jehovah of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. In the book of Enoch, the cherubim, seraphim, and ophanim, wheels, and all the angels of the power of constitute the host of God, the guardians of his throne, and the singers of praise, ascribing the blessedness of the Lord of spirits, with the archangel Gabriel at their head. So in the Jewish daily liturgy, the seraphim, ophanim, and the living creatures constitute the heavenly choir, who the elect ministers of the living God, ready to do the will of their Maker. The Maker with trembling intone the sweet harmony of the thrice holy. In the Talmud, the cherubim are represented as having the likeness of youths, with fanciful etymology. We'll leave that there, like a youth. So while according to the Midrash, they have no definite shape, but appear indifferently as men and or women, or as spirits and angelic beings. So again, I think this is a really good entry that shows the similarity between these things. And I'll call to mind what we've mentioned probably just enough, if not too much. And that is the reality that because of angelic creation by fiat, that these creatures might differ in appearance. They might be different creatures, right? We can imagine how as there is this constant need, we don't have any indication that angels have need for rest, although when they visit Abraham, they clearly kind of put their feet up, they sit down a little bit. So that would be probably one of the more unknown features. However, it's not shocking or at all that there would be different angelic creatures rather than just one static set, right? So the idea being that being overly dogmatic about the distinctions between cherubim and seraphim would be probably pretty difficult. These, however, or as Isaiah notices these creatures, particularly for that burning holiness, that burning passionate love and glorification of God. So, God's holy court does not always need to be the same, right? They may or may not be the same creatures. It's difficult to say. Again, I in the past favored them being distinct, and the more I study and the more I think about it, the more I think that they're at least serving such a similar function that they could be, again, just different in the sense that they're different individuals, but they are serving the same office and function. God's holy courtroom does not always need to be the same is an interesting point, though. Right. The reality that the heavenly throne room, like any other throne room, would have variation and variety. In fact, that's exactly what we see, right, in the distinctions between the perspective on heaven, which we get in Job, the perspective on heaven, which we get in Isaiah, and then the visions of Ezekiel, and then finally John. We see that there is change, there's movement, there's things going on the heavenly scene, on the heavenly throne room, where there's actual change. It's not just a static, unmoving computer program. It is another real place with real, dynamic elements to it. right? So there truly should be no struggle for us to understand that. Again, it's only our reductionist viewpoint, rather, if we want to put it that way, because we don't, and this is the case with everything. I once was talking to two people, listening to two people talk, and one one said, there's just those people who are just boring. They've got nothing in their life. And the other fellow, maybe a bit wiser, said, yeah, everyone I don't know is that way, right? The point being that, of course, we look around, and because we don't know what's going on in the lives of those around us, we assume that they're boring, one-dimensional, simple, uninteresting, right? But if you actually got to know that person, you'd find that very likely they would have thoughts, interests, passions. They'd have a developed family life and all that other business. And I think we do the same thing when we think about heaven, when we think about God, when we think about God's abode, when we think about the heavenly throne room, when we think about angels, right? We go, well, I don't really understand that. So we make it one-dimensional. We essentially turn the revelation about God's world and goodness into a flannel graph in our own minds, right? And that's no shade on the flannel graph. The flannel graph is a great teaching tool, I think. I imagine it's been replaced by some technology, but we want to note that that we, as we look at these passages, as we look at these things, we don't want to minimize them, but rather recognize that we're being brought into or exposed to a world of far greater complexity, beauty, import, and again, change than we are really equipped to understand. So again, just to recap what we can learn very dogmatically from this. First of all, we see that there is the Lord is sitting on a throne, and his train of his robe fills the temple. Fascinatingly, there is no mention of the council, so we could say the divine council is not meeting perhaps at this time, and yet the throne room still exists. God in his glory has a special presence on the throne. We saw that picture of the train of his robe filling the temple is quite a powerful image, right? And showing the glory of God. And above it stood these things, right? These creatures. We see that they are reverent towards God. I've read some rather overexcited explanations of these that are rather fanciful in nature and try to relate their snake-likeness, which I think we've already seen is not a safe or a good biblical judgment, to somehow to sin or to their fallenness. But here they are, obviously glorifying God and protecting his holiness. And again, he has faces, they have feet, and they have wings. So again, it's probably best to view these as winged humanoid creatures, just like the cherubim in large case. So they're also crying, holy, holy, holy. And this is back to why we sing this song. It's been wonderful just to sing this song at the beginning of each session. Why? Because it highlights they are there to declare the holiness, the otherness of God, the supremacy of God in all things. And he's called the Lord of hosts. And this here is pointing us to the heavenly hosts. So again, the Lord Yahweh, God's the God of Israel's position is above all of the other spiritual forces, and they are his hosts, they are his armies, they're in his command. It says the whole earth is full of his glory. Now that is really a fascinating statement, given the fact that the earth is full of sin. And as we've seen, there's quite a number of fallen angels that have great positions of authority, power, and are doing great damage in the world, as well as sinful men. And yet the whole earth is still full of his glory as we look at the beauty of creation, the purpose and function of creation. And even after the terrible events of the flood that marred the earth tremendously and brought about a very different set of living conditions, even more so, or seemingly even more profoundly effective than the fall of man upon the ecology of the world, even still, it speaks to his glory. The whole world is filled with a testimony of praise. And Psalm 19 gives us some good imagery of thinking on that. And the posts of the doors were shaken by the voice of him who cried out, and the voice was filled with smoke. So this is really interesting. First of all, it's not as if like we were singing so beautifully, right? So they're all singing together. It seems that they're crying out to one another in some sort of chorus going going back and forth. And this, to me, draws to the line the image of what Moses told the Israelites to do, is to set up on these two mountains and cry out to one another the blessings. One side would cry out the blessings of obeying, and the other side would cry out the curses. We see this sort of antiphonal musical, or even just antiphonal speech going back and forth in scripture, as well as in worship. We continue to see it throughout church history. These wonderful antiphonal, pieces where two groups or two choirs or whatever, two groups within the choir sing back and forth. And it seems to be something of that, as if they're telling one another, and of course, all who would be viewing this scene, and ourselves, by the Lord's revelation and grace. But when they do this, we see that the doors are shaken. And the voice is so great that they cry out that it actually causes things to shake. I know that we've all had some experience like that, where you either hear a loud crash of something outdoors, or maybe you hear jets ahead, and we feel the vibration of that great amount of noise that's put forth. And that's the degree of volume that's being put forth. And I think what that suggests is that fallen Isaiah, even in terms of what he can hear, right? His ability, he can hear what's going on, but it is overwhelming to his sensory experience, right? It's just, he's not built for that world. He's not meant for constant existence in that world. And there's a discomfort there as a result, it would seem. And so he responds with rightful humility. And this is another important point as we see and evaluate different sorts of people or claim for experiences in heaven and so on and so forth. It's interesting how often the ones that are clearly made up are comfort experiences, or, oh, it's so nice, it's so this and that. But it seems that Isaiah has a more typical experience in being so overwhelmed by the beauty and the majesty and the foreignness of this scene that he's been brought into, that it brings him to a place of devastation after a fashion, saying, "Woe unto me, I am undone." And he knows the reason why. I'm a man of unclean lips. He sees his sin as being the point. And this is important to our discussion, is that one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a live coal. So again, this picture of the cleansing nature of fire, if you like. And he brings it to the lips of, it says, taken with tongs. So he doesn't hold it with his hand, as I just motioned. Rather, taken with tongs from the fire on the altar, right? So this is the altar of which the earthly altar that the Jews had at the time of Isaiah, was a copy. And yet he takes some of this from the altar, right, which is obviously a place of sacrifice, where sin is paid for, right? Where sin was where sin is representatively paid for. Obviously, that is all looking forward to the sacrifice of Christ. But it's pretty a remarkable standing that he then takes the tongs and touches it to Isaiah's mouth, so that the angel has a place in administrating the cleansing power of God. And he says, again, this is, it seems to be that the seraph now speaks. Who knows if it's as loud? He says, "Behold, this has touched your lips. Your iniquity is taken away and your sin purged." So it's a pretty powerful point in the ability for saved, again, or elect angels, saved. Goodness gracious. There's no saved angels. They're simply elect. They're not fallen or fallen. But this angelic beast, or this celestial creature, this celestial being, has a part in God's plan that is cleansing for this purpose, as sort of an atonement power to make it possible for Isaiah to be here. So it also shows that Isaiah's sense that he didn't belong here was accurate, and God provided for that through the cleansing action of purging the sin using the coal from the altar of sacrifice and burning. So it's a very powerful passage, and again, challenges us, I think, in our imagination as we try to grasp after what these creatures, what this amazing scene looks like. And I think it's extra important for us to do so, as we pointed out, because you, if you're a believer today, will one day stand on that heavenly scene. In fact, if any of us are to be called home by a death in this these times, then we go to be face to face with the Lord. As Paul says, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So I believe that we'll have a unique experience as a part of this world. And interestingly, the next time we are confident that we'll be there is in the book of Revelation. We see the 24 elders as I believe, the representation of us, of the church in that room, in that place, in that time, with new bodies, clothed as he clothed the church in white robes, with crowns, the Stephanos crowns that he promised to the church, and the church in that regard. So we'll get to sit there and see this scene. We'll get to take it in, and unlike Isaiah, we'll be in new glorified bodies and be able to stand it, if you want to say it, be less humbled by it, because again, Isaiah was so confident in his sinfulness. All right, now we get to move on to Isaiah 14:12 through 15. And it reads, "How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning, how you are cut down to the ground, you who weakened the nations, for you have said in your heart, I will ascend into heaven. I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will also sit on the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High, yet you shall be brought down to Sheol, to the lowest depths of the pit." Remember when we talked about Genesis 6, and I said there are just some passages that make people really mad. Well, this is one that makes people really mad, and I can't tell you why. It's interesting to me how, especially when we get to the areas of the biblical revelation, wherein we have less information, we know that we're making some leaps, that people tend to get the most animated and the most angry. I wish people would get as frustrated with the perversion of the gospel or lordship salvation, or these things that are really painfully destructive to the body of Christ, and not get so hot and bothered over some of these peripheral issues that we could say, well, I could see your argument, but I still think it's this, right? I just find it to be really an interesting thing that maybe it's some sort of dysfunction in our soul that likes to get excited about the things that we can't really prove. Maybe it's the insecurity in our soul that's not comfortable admitting, yeah, I guess we don't have all the answers on that. But whatever it is, I would encourage you to be better. I would encourage you to be able to look at these things and say, wow, there's two viewpoints on this. And I do your diligence, have the diligent effort to understand it and look at both sides of the argument as best you can. And, with confidence say, as far as the word of God is clear, I am certain, and where I'm uncertain, I'm willing to admit that. And so anyway, there's a little prologue to this. Because some people get really mad if you talk about this as being a reference to Satan or Lucifer, the first fallen angel. They want to see it exclusively in terms of its historical referent, that is the king of Babylon. So let's look at some of these viewpoints so we can be informed, and you can less accuse me of straw manning other people's arguments on the issue. Verse 12, this is Adam Clarke. "O Lucifer, son of the morning," the versions in general agree in this translation, the rendering of Hallel, remember we talked about that, as signifying Lucifer, and then Phosphoros, the morning star, right? Phosphorus, whether Jupiter or Venus, as these are both bringers of the morning light or the morning star. Just to be clear, Jupiter and Venus there, he's talking about the planets, not the Greek and Roman deities per se. "As these are both bringers of the morning light or morning stars annually in their turn, and although the context speaks explicitly concerning Nebuchadnezzar, yet this has been, I know not why, applied to the chief of the fallen angels, who is most incongruously denominated Lucifer, the bringer of light, an epithet as common to him as those of Satan and devil. That the Holy Spirit by his prophets should call this arch enemy of God and man a light bringer would be strange indeed. And the truth is, this text speaks nothing at all concerning Satan or his fall, nor the occasion of that fall, which many divines have with great confidence deduced from this text. How necessary it is to understand the literal meaning of Scripture. The preposterous comments may be prevented. Besides, I doubt much whether a translation to be correct of Hallel, which we translate Lucifer, comes from Kalal, Yalal, Well, that's an interesting transliteration. Yell, howl, shriek, and should be translated howl, son of the morning. So this is the Syriac to understand this meaning, and Michaelis contends in his reasons of Parkhurst under halal. So again, to point out, there's difficulty. Hebrew's tough. Hebrew is difficult. I would contend that whether or not this is talking about Lucifer, it is obviously talking about someone who's in a bad spot, in a bad shape, and the phrase "son of the morning" is still applied. So taking that from Lucifer and applying it to, say, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, doesn't alleviate the pressure much. However, on the other side, we can say with absolute confidence that when Satan was created, he was indeed glorious and had a very glorious purpose here on the earth as well as in heaven. We'll get more on that, more clarity on that as we look at Ezekiel. But we want to point out that ultimately, in my mind, this doesn't alleviate much tension to try to remove Satan from this. And we'll look at arguments for that as we go forward. This is Michael Rydelnik, a great scholar of the Old Testament and of the Bible. It says, some have understood the words of 14:12-15 as an address to Satan, describing his fall. This the support for this is found in Daniel 10, where demons and angels are associated with nations, influencing the affairs of humanity. Hence, as the power of behind Babylon, Satan's fall is described as being to make himself like the Most High. That is difficult. The difficulty with this interpretation, and what makes it unlikely, is that there's no change of address syntactically. It appears to be addressed to the king of Babylon. So I think that's a more balanced view. Certainly Clarke's rather ignorant rant doesn't really satisfy. Rydelnik seems to favor the view that Satan's not directly in perspective, but he recognizes the obvious connection here and the importance of understanding, as we've already pointed out with quite a lot of repetition, that there is a relationship between nations and these angelic, fallen or otherwise angelic authorities. So this being the case, it doesn't surprise us at all when we look at that and say, oh, well, yes, he might be addressing the human who is in charge, but he's looking past the human that's in charge to the one that is spiritually in control of him in that place. So that helps us, I think, clarify what's going on there. Warren Wiersbe gives, I think, even a more enjoyable take on it. He says, the prophet saw in this event something far deeper than the defeat of an empire. The fall of the king of Babylon, he saw the defeat of Satan, the prince of this world, who seeks to energize and motivate the leaders of nations. Daniel 10:20 indicates that Satan has assigned princes or fallen angels. We'll get more on that later in our study, not this evening, I believe, to the various nations so he can influence leaders to act contrary to the will of God. The highest of God's angels tried to usurp the throne of God and capture for himself the worship that belongs only to God. The name Lucifer, morning star, indicates that Satan tries to imitate Jesus Christ, who is the bright and morning star. I will be like the Most High, reveals his basic strategy. For he's an imitator of Isaiah 14:14, 2 Corinthians 11:13-15. Like the king of Babylon, Satan will one day be humiliated and defeated. He will be cast out of heaven in Revelation 12, and finally cast into hell, Revelation 20, verse 10. Whether God is dealing with kings or angels, Proverbs 16:18 is still true. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. So now we're into the question. While it must be admitted that this passage is not referring to the head of the fallen angels as clearly as Ezekiel 28 to me is so apparent, right? The things that he says are so obviously not applicable to any human and have to be just almost a comical level of overstatement, which is not impossible. But again, that's an even firmer case. We have to recognize that there is a strong content of this passage, and Wiersbe has, I think, a far stronger interpretation and better understanding of the nature of this referent and the special things that are said about this in this passage that differ from the things and the judgments that are said towards some of the other leaders that are judged in Isaiah. This passage gives important information about the fall of Satan, as well as possibly being the only passage to refer to the enemy by his proper name, Hallel, before the moment of rebellion. If indeed this passage is describing the fall of Satan, it accurately describes Satan's desire to usurp the place of Christ and rule over the cosmos with unchecked and unquestioned authority. The most interesting thing about this passage is that the fallen one does not say he will be the Most High, but that he will be like the Most High. This shows that perhaps there was a small limitation in the insanity of the adversary, his desire to rule over all things, but not over all things regarding this creation, not over all things, but only over all things regarding to this creation. This fact actually helps us understand his attack on mankind. It seems clear that the evil one was jealous of that stewardship of the earth was given, not to him in all his glory, but to the earthly creation, mankind. So again, with recognition of the reality that you might not be with me on this in terms of this being Satan, and we can still be friends. If we go with that understanding that there is a second referent behind the king of Babylon that's being referenced, then we note there are some important bits of information about his fall. And I just want to highlight this. He wants to ascend into heaven and exalt his throne above the stars of God. Now that's fascinating. He wants the stars of God here, I think, is apparent for authority over all the other angelic beings. Stars are often utilized as angelic, language for an angelic referent. While this would be something quite amazing for the king of Babylon too, and although megalomania is certainly not impossible, and the insanity of a man who set himself up against God can go easily this far, that it makes a great deal of sense in light of the satanic account. He wanted authority over everything, but it interestingly does not necessarily say that he wants to, have authority over God. He just kind of wants his job. I will also sit in the mount of the congregation on the farthest sides of the north. See, now that's an interesting thing. This is a direction, right? North in this directional has this point of relationship to the physical cosmos, and specifically the physical earth, right? He wants to have a place on this planet. He wants to ascend above the heights of the clouds, right? Still in reference to the space here on earth, I will be like the Most High. So in other words, he doesn't want to, if this is indeed characteristic of the attitude of Satan, then he doesn't want to replace the Most High. He wants to be like the Most High. He wants to imitate him. He wants to be the God of this world. And what do we see? At Genesis 3, he wrestled it from the hands of Adam and Eve, and we see that he increased his influence over the earth in Genesis 6. And then at the Tower of Babel, we see that there's this growing sphere in which Satan has, to some degree or another, gotten his wish. It says, yet you shall be brought down to Sheol, to the lowest depths of the pit. And as we've seen, that is the future that is ahead for Satan. Certainly it would be ahead for the king of Babylon. But this shows us the attitude of Satan. And it shows us as well, again, that this wasn't some sort of heavenly conflict that Satan had, with God out there somewhere, that this was a conflict over the earth. And I think this lends great credibility to the idea that the fall of Satan occurred at Genesis 3. What was he trying to do? Wrestle the earth, wrestle this cosmos. He wanted to be the God of this world. God created this. He formed it. He shaped it. He filled it. It was beautiful. And Satan felt as if it was inappropriate for him to create humans to be the co-regents or stewards over creation. He wanted that job. And so he challenged God's will in that, and still believes evidently that he's right and he should be in charge. And I don't know how he feels he's doing, but that is the nature of the conflict that's going on here, is that we essentially as humans will either rightly relate to our creator, or there's nothing left for us to do to be ultimately sided with Satan. All right, let's move on to Ezekiel's amazing visions, the amazing visions of Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 1 and chapter 10 are mind-blowing. In fact, I remember reading these verses early on in my Christian life and just thinking, what in the world did I just read? These wheels and eyes and creatures and chariots, and what is going on? It's just insane. It's mind-blowing. It's boggling to imagine what this would feel like, what this would be like, how this is going to present itself. And I just want to move, if we can, to Ezekiel 1 and again, I think one of the things that my brain does when I am presented with things that are beyond my understanding is I kind of go to sleep in my own head and go, I don't get this. This is too weird. I'm out. I'm closing my eyes. I don't see it. I don't see it. But let's listen and really appreciate the magnificence of this revelation that begins Ezekiel's prophetic message to us, but ministry after fashion. So take a drink because we're going to take a big read here. Now it came to pass in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I was among the captives by the river Chebar, that the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, which was in the 5th year of King Jehoiachin's captivity, the word of the Lord came expressly to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Chebar. And the hand of the Lord was upon him there. And I looked, and behold, a whirlwind was coming out of the north, a great cloud with raging fire engulfing itself, and brightness was all around it, and radiating out of the midst of the color of amber, out of the midst of the fire. Also from within it came the likeness of four living creatures. And this was their appearance. They had the likeness of a man. Each had 4 faces. Each one had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the soles of calves' feet, and they sparkled like the color of burnished bronze. The hands of the man were under their wings and on their 4 sides, and each of their 4 faces had wings. Their wings touched one another. The creatures did not turn when they went, but each one went straight forward. As for the likeness of their faces, each had the face of a man. Each of the 4 had a face of a lion on the right side. Each of the 4 had a face of an ox on the left side. Each of the 4 had a face of an eagle. Thus were their faces. Their wings stretched upward. 2 wings of each one touched one another, and 2 covered their bodies. And each one went straight forward, and they went wherever the Spirit wanted to go, and they did not turn when they went. For as for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire. Their appearance of torches going back and forth among the living creatures. The fire was bright, and out of the fire went lightning, and the living creatures ran back and forth in appearance like a flash of lightning. Now, as I looked at the living creatures, behold, a wheel was on the earth beside each living creature. It had with its 4 faces. The appearance of the wheels of their workings was like the color of beryl, and all 4 had the same likeness. The appearance of their workings was, as it were, a wheel in the middle of a wheel. When they moved, they went toward as one of the 4 directions. They did not turn aside as they went, for their rims, they were so high, they were awesome, and their rims were full of eyes all around the 4 of them. Then the living creature went, the wheels went beside them, and when the living creatures were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up. Wherever the Spirit wanted to go, they went, because the Spirit went, and the wheels were lifted together with them. For the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When those went, these went, and when those stood, these stood, and when those were lifted up from the earth, the wheels were lifted up together with them. And from the spirits of the living creatures was in the wheels. The likeness of the firmament above the heads of these living creatures was like the color of the awesome crystal stretched out over their heads. Under the firmament, their wings spread out straight, one toward another. Each one had 2, which covered one side. Each one had 2, which covered the other side of its body. And when they went, I heard noise of their wings, like the noise of many waters, like the voice of the Almighty. A tumult like the noise of an army. And when they stood still, they let down their wings. A voice came from above the firmament that was over their heads whenever they stood, so they let down their wings. And above the firmament over their heads was the likeness of a throne, in appearance like a sapphire stone. And like the likeness of the throne was a likeness with the appearance of the man high above it. Also the appearance of its waist, and upward I saw there were a color of amber with the appearance of fire all around it. And from the appearance of his waist and downward, I saw, as it were, the appearance of fire and brightness all around, like the appearance of a rainbow in a cloud on a rainy day. So it was the appearance of the brightness all around it. This is the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. Aliens. Sorry. Just it's so amazing, right? And if you're ever watching this kind of goofy, History Channel aliens, they're often going to reference the amazing enormity of this vision that Ezekiel has, and that what it displays about the angelic creatures as they carry about the Merkava, the chariot of God's glory here. So again, I'm sorry to be so insistent upon this, but because I believe that you're intelligent and that you're with it, and if you haven't agreed with me now, you're not going to. But we have to ask again: are these people or these angels, these beings, are they borrowed from Babylon or Assyria? So while these parallels to other ancient cultures are interesting, that people will make, it is amazing that the assumption that the biblical authors borrow from secular paganism. Why is that? It seems also to imply that the vision was somehow fraudulent, and Ezekiel was writing non-literally, that he didn't actually see this. Now, I do want to be very clear that Hebrew symbolism is meaningful. That is to say that when we look at their glory and their wings and all this thing, that it has meaning. It is meaning, not just, hey, that's how they looked and that's how they looked, but it has meaning indeed, that of spiritual significance. But the idea that Ezekiel is just giving some sort of acid trip version of theology and not actually witnessing these things, I think is really problematic for the text. And yet again, with the anti-supernaturalist bias that so many modern Bible interpreters take with them, it's fascinating that oftentimes non-believing interpreters do a better job, because they say, well, I don't agree with any of it. I don't believe it, but this is clearly what it says. So they will come to the more supernaturalist viewpoint. And for some reason, I think people trying to make believers, even genuine believers, trying to make compromises, will sort of try to reduce the greatness of this, the amazing, almost unimaginable nature of it, rather than be blown away by the beauty and the glory and the amazing spiritual reality that exists in and through and behind everything. We try to go, it was just a nice poem, right? And so we don't do that. So there's other explanations. First of all, for all the similarities, Ezekiel has surely seen these foreign gods, never makes a comparison. Ezekiel spent time, right? Ezekiel was there. He was in Babylon. He knew it was not, certainly we can tell from the quality of his writing, is by no means ignorant. Why wouldn't he say, I saw that one as the one, just like the ones that sit on the pagan temple? Why wouldn't he say that? What would keep him from saying that? As we've seen, there's no reason that these kind of, I would say, compromising teachers will do. They don't mind saying, yeah, he borrowed it from them, and that was showing that the God of Israel was greater than their gods, that all their gods serve him, and they come to these, in my mind, wild interpretations. But the funny thing here is that there's no indication in the text that that was the intent, desire, or thought. In fact, it's more amazing that he doesn't make the comparison, in my mind, or that they don't make the comparison. They, in fact, just describe a creature that is known throughout Jewish history and throughout the Hebrew text and writing, and also, as we'll see, the extra biblical writings, without any reference to like those. Which, by the way, anytime you're teaching or talking or telling about something, especially something that someone else wasn't there for, aren't you constantly drawing for the next greatest analogy? Anything close, anything clear, just make it, just to make a comparison so I can get my mind around it. Isn't that what makes it so difficult to read these passages? Because our imaginations are just racked. Wouldn't it be great to say, oh, well, just look at that statue over there. It's kind of like that, or it is like that, or it's exactly that, whatever it is. Yet we don't see that. We see that he is appealing to the popular imagination and understanding knowledge base of the Jewish people based upon what they already knew. And again, his audience, by and large, entirely, would have seen these pictures, the images that were extant in and around the temple, potentially. Around the temple. So there would be some idea or some way of getting an idea as well. They wouldn't, of course, go into the Holy of Holies. But Let's see here. It's clear that the author in no way equates these creatures with pagan religion. That's the point. Secondly, even a cursory examination of the extra biblical writings will show that the Israelites were well informed that there were other angelic beings about, which little or nothing was known. So there's no reason to constantly accuse the Israelites of borrowing and copying. And finally, Israel was a nation of great importance in the reign of David and Solomon. Thus, it is just as well to think that these other nations drew either upon what had originated in Israel or upon some larger shared memory that had been passed down from the antediluvian era. One way that or the other, it never fails to surprise me, at least, that the biblical text, even in the mind of an academically inclined believer, is always guilty until proven innocent. I just find that fascinating, right? We're the believers. We're the ones who are like, yeah, I'm convinced, I am persuaded this is the word of God. And yet sometimes it's those believers who are so just blinded by the attitude of this age and unwilling to go back and recognize that our modern worldview, our modern perspective on life is in no way superior to the biblical worldview, the biblical perspective on life, because this is the one that God put forth. So we have to recognize that it was given in that certain context and not try to impute our modern way of thinking back into it in order to, we'll come to perverse conclusions. All right, Ezekiel 28, 11 through 19, more about Satan. Okay, so let's turn over to Ezekiel 28. We didn't, just wanted to make another point right here. What's going on here in this passage and chapter 10 as well, is what we have is Ezekiel, right, in anticipation of the destruction of the temple. You see God himself is removing his presence, removing his glory from Israel. So Israel, we know, had been, and Judah specifically, also had been disobedient. They had not followed God's will and desire for them. They had rejected him. They had fallen into paganism and on and on and on. And thus Isaiah, Jeremiah especially pronounce that there is a judgment coming, that Babylon is going to come and have victory over them, as well as Hezekiah, right, and others. So we see this uniform picture of the coming destruction at the hands of Babylon. And here Ezekiel gets the vision of the spiritual presence, like his eyes are open to see the spiritual reality as the Merkava, I keep using the Hebrew term, the chariot of God is taken up. And so we see a movement, a departing of God's glory from the temple. So that's the picture. That's why he sees it on earth versus like being taken up to the heaven and seen. You see that God's glory is being removed from the temple. That is no longer at that point, going to be a meeting place between God and man, because the Babylonians were going to destroy the temple and make it defunct. It wouldn't be rebuilt until Ezra came back, right? Substantially. And so we see this picture of what is a tragedy in the eyes of Ezekiel, and as the glory of God, that meeting place between man and God is being removed. And so these angels that don't have to turn, right, as they're the cherubim, these angelic beings, seem to be working these wheels within wheels. And for some reason, over the years, as I've thought about it, I kind of think about them like not like shopping cart wheels, but like the wheels you see on with a swivel to them. But they don't have a swivel to them. It's obviously something that can move this way and that. And again, we can see where the fantastical. Is that right? Fantastical interpretations of the aliens people on TV can look at this and say, doesn't that sound like a spaceship? That's technology we don't have, and blah, blah, blah. But it does appear as if they're kind of working the machine at some level or another that is lifting up the glorious presence or concentrated presence of God on the spiritual realm. And so again, we see evidence that in the biblical worldview, there is a spiritual reality that we can say is related to space and time, but not confined to space and time, certainly. But somehow, just as Jacob saw the angels coming up and down the staircase, just as he saw the forces, the angelic forces, spread out before him. So we see here the glory of the Lord, and that which has previously appeared, right, as a cloud of smoke, and the Shekinah glory is now being removed, taken up, removed from Israel. And so that's sort of the picture that we have there. So with that, I think I'd like to save Ezekiel 28 for this evening. We can start off with that, and then we'll go through Daniel and the rest. But hopefully these amazing pictures will give you a good, clear shot. Of what's going on there.
Brad?
Yeah.
Does anybody have any questions for Brother Brad?